just a bit of background. Myself, when I was a young child growing up in Surrey, BC, I lived in a lower working class area, in a lower working class family. Our heroes were not Lester B. Pearson, nor were they Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The heroes among the adults where I grew up were César Sauvé and the Farm Workers Association. As children, and I imagine many of you here, we didn't know what grapes tasted like for 18 years of our lives because of boycotts. Another was Jean-Claude Perrault and the Canadian Union Postal Workers, and our boycott of using postal codes. Most revered of all, however, when I was a child growing up in that area was Mr. Nader. Although I was just a young child, I knew that the rear axles of GM Corvairs were wont to fall down at worst times. And things didn't change much. 20 years later, my wife had a Ford Escort whose motor mount used to break loose when she'd be driving highway speeds down the freeway. I remember as a young child, my mother reaching her hand up in the front seat like this. I asked her why there was an accident on the Portman Freeway on the bridge. She said she was trying to stop my younger brother from flying through the back seat up to the front. When I was 17, my mother wasn't there, and I went to the front windshield of a 1964 Chevrolet Impala. For that, I got $1,000 from the insurance company until never to come back again, along with a fractured skull and permanent head scars. Hopefully now, because of Ralph Nader, that won't happen to other children. Mothers won't be reaching up their arms in front seats to protect their children from catapulting through the front windshields of cars. Ralph Nader was born February 27, 1934. He's an American attorney, political activist in the areas of consumer rights, humanitarianism, environmentalism, and democratic government. Mr. Nader has been a staunch critic of corporations, which he believes wield way too much power, and are undermining the fundamental American values of democracy and human rights. He helped found many government and non-government organizations, including the Environment Protection Agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Public Citizen, and several public interest research groups, including the newly formed Regina Public Interest Research Group here at the University of Regina. Mr. Nader has also been candidate for United States President 3 times. We hope he runs again. I'd like to welcome Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, Gerson. Thank you all for coming. Can I be heard in the back? Okay, thank you. A lecture has been described a little satirically as having the same relation to the intellect as massage has to exercise. So I'm going to sprinkle a few challenges to us all, and to start with the action part of it. Right outside on your way out, there are some very good materials presented by the Green Party of Canada. And there's a book that's coming out shortly, but you got an early preview called Canada's Deadly Secret, Saskatchewan Uranium in the Global Nuclear System by Jim Harding, with an introduction by Helen Caldecott. This is your province. And one of the prerequisites of civic engagement is to find out what's happening to us. And the nuclear fuel cycle, from uranium mining, perhaps eventually to returning radioactive waste from around the world to the mines here, maybe in the planning stage. And of course, all over the world, where there's depleted uranium and nuclear weaponry, etc., this province has a connection to all this. And it's very important to have a book out on your province. I mean, most books are on nations and worlds, but this one by Jim Harding. How many of you have heard of Jim Harding? Okay, so where are you, Jim? He's out there agitating. He'll sign for you. Anyway, third is I'm very pleased that the students have formed Regina Berg. There are now Perth in Ontario and Dalhousie and Vancouver and Alberta. And they are basically nonprofit corporations run by students, funded by students, with the staff to deal with environmental, consumer problems, convening functions, etc. And in that way, they fill a gap that the universities have never filled, which is teaching civic practice, student civic skills, practicing democracy, connecting knowledge to action. Here also is the head of Democracy Watch in Ottawa. How many of you have heard of Democracy Watch? Right. Duff Honecker is here. He started it, and the website is dwatch.ca. dwatch.ca. Very prominently involved in government ethics reform. Got quite a few bills through the Parliament. And he's the chief watchdog for the banks. That's probably where you saw him on TV. Are you here, Duff? Yeah, Duff's out back there, the tall basketball player. And he's out there if you want to connect with anything that he's doing, or you want to give him some more grievances for him to deal with. And last is there's a new book coming out. In fact, it just came out this week by Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. This is quite a book. How many of you have heard of Naomi Klein? Yeah. Yeah, she's really cut above most muckraking journalists in terms of the detail. He had a piece in the Nation on what's happening to the tar sands up in Alberta, which most people in the United States are not aware of. My topic is the global economy, and it is quite important to define the primary actor in the global economy, which is a multinational corporation. A multinational corporation is not like any corporation. They make the rules. They don't have to challenge the rules. And part of those rules are in the form of NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, and in the architecture of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Multinational corporations are not like small business. They're not capitalism in the sense that if you can't make it, you fail, because if they can't make it, they go to Ottawa or Washington, D.C. for bailout, handout, giveaway, guarantee, subsidies. And they also have turned capitalism upside down in terms of the principle that whoever owns something should have a reasonable amount of control over it. Well, the shareholders own these corporations. They don't have any control over it, not even big ones. They're basically told by management, the officers and the board of directors, you don't like what we're doing? Sell out. Exit. No voice. And that is not capitalism. So what will we call it? Well, we can call it corporate capitalism. That's a benign term. We can call it corporate socialism, which means that they have so controlled government that they can turn it against its own people on behalf of corporate misbehavior. That is, the government becomes the guarantor, the defender, the subsidizer, the feeder, the protector here and abroad of these large corporations, using military resources, financial resources, deciding who's going to get taxed where on behalf of these multinationals. The Pulitzer Prize-winning tax reporter for the New York Times wrote a book a few years ago called Perfectly Legal. His name is David K. Johnston. And very few people know as much as he does about the machinations of corporate taxation and its connection abroad. And he basically concluded that these corporations are so large they can decide where they're going to be taxed, when they're going to be taxed, and how much they're going to be taxed. Whether they're going to be in the Bahamas or some other low tax haven, or whether they're going to use certain shelters, loopholes, etc. They pretty much carved it out themselves. So increasingly they're heading for non-tax status. When you actually add up all the subsidies and all our tax dollars that they get, and then take the rate they're supposed to pay and deduct all the loopholes and shelters, a lot of them are down to zero. ExxonMobil made last year $1,700 a second. A second. $1,700 a second after taxes, such as they were. Now, what is a corporation? It is a conglomerate, power machine of capital, technology, labor, radiating in all directions, political, media, educational, and the like. But what is it really? It's an artificial entity. It's not a human being. It is chartered by, you have crown corporations, your corporations are chartered by your governments, and our corporations are chartered primarily by state governments. The corporation would not exist if the government didn't create it, because the government gives it the charter where it's supposed to have certain rules of operation, and government has done this since the early 1800s in the modern corporate form. And in the early 1800s, we always pick Massachusetts because that's where they started the textile industry. The legislature would create every corporation with a special bill in Massachusetts. And of course, the key thing that the investors wanted, who wanted to form this corporation, investors finance the corporation, they don't create it, the government creates it. They want limited liability. So the only liability, the only money they would put at risk would be the money they put in the corporation. It wouldn't be any other investments or any other property that they had outside the corporation. So this artificial entity is created and was never designed to have the power it has now. The early state legislators were very worried that this entity would not grow into a Frankenstein. So they had it on short leash. They would say, we're going to charter this textile company for 10 years, and then we're going to have the company ask for a renewal on good behavior. All these companies were supposed to fulfill a public purpose. That's the phrase that was used. Well, companies thought this was very restrictive. So sometime in the middle of the 19th century, they got the chartering function out of the legislature into a government agency, the executive branch. And it gave them more leeway. They started to be able to do things that weren't just textiles, for example, or weren't just producing hammers or cars or whatever. They could produce anything. So they got more leeway on what they could do. And second, they concentrated more power away from the shareholders. As more and more shareholders bought in, it wasn't a family corporation. And so the power got sucked up to the board of directors and officers more and more. Thirdly, corporations expanded their political influence. They started giving money to politicians, hiring them when they retired from their elective or appointed office. They started having public relations arms. They started connecting with universities to get legitimacy. And of course now, they are performing military functions in Iraq. Now they are increasingly the government. The governments in both our countries are outsourcing. They're contracting out more and more and more of what we would consider fairly pristine governmental functions. Speeches written for the Secretary of Energy year after year in our country are written by private consulting firms outside of Washington. They actually contract out the speech that the Secretary of Energy gives. Not only military functions, security function. Companies now have the contract from the Pentagon to screen and hire people for highly sensitive security jobs in the government. Military weapons manufacturers now write the compliance testing standards for the weapons under contract by which they are supposed to comply with when they build the plane or the ship or the artillery. It's hard to find out anything out that is not contracted out. So it harkens back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's famous comment to the Congress in 1939 when he urged them to set up an investigating commission about corporate power. And he said, and I'll paraphrase him, when public government is controlled by private economic power, that is fascism. This is before World War II, gave fascism another name and meaning. But the clinical meaning of fascism is private economic power, read corporations, controlling public power. And the same New York Times reporter, David J. Johnston, is coming out with a book this year called Free Lunch. It's a meticulous analysis of how corporations literally control government agencies and turn them against the very people that government is supposed to serve. You may have heard of the student loan racket in the United States. Instead of the government loaning money to college and university students for those horrendously high tuitions that you're not so prone to, they allowed private corporations to get into business with a government guarantee. So these corporations like Sallie Mae could keep all their profits, but if they had any losses or any student defaults, Uncle Sam would make up the difference. That's corporate socialism. Corporate socialism is when you have a political economy where the companies keep the profits and lay off the losses on the taxpayer. So turning the government against its own people is the latest stage in the permutation of reversing the whole expectation that the early legislators had when created corporations, which was corporations were designed to be our servants, not our masters. They are now our masters, and we are their servants. Civic values now are subordinated to corporate values. Commercialism is moving into areas that were once taboo by social custom or religious practice. When I was growing up in Connecticut, companies never sold us directly what they're selling kids today. They didn't bypass parents. They didn't undermine parental authority. They would sell us bubble gum, maybe directly. Now look what corporations are selling children. Violent programming, and these children are often alone in the afternoon. Parents are at work. Violent pornographic programming, violent video games, junk food, junk drink, literally tempting them, seducing them through all kinds of little characters, McDonald's characters, so on, into eating the kind of food and nagging their parents to eat the kind of food that is increasing obesity levels at an alarming level, diabetes, high blood pressure at a premature age, literally eating them into disease. And lying about it, making it appeal that it's going to strengthen them and make them more active and better at athletics. The deception here, in addition to taste factors, where they turn their tongues against their brains. Corporations now have corporatized universities to a level unheard of in the past. MIT is increasingly part of the Pentagon. When Professor Ted Postel, who came to Canada to argue against your ballistic missiles proposal to join the U.S. in the boondoggle, where the U.S. spending $9.5 billion a year on a technology that the American Society of Physicists said will never work in terms of missile defense, as if people are going to send missiles over here, which have a return address. If they want to do that, they'll use a suitcase in New York City. But if they do send a missile, all they got to do is decoy it with balloons and knocks out the missile defense, which is one of the arguments the American Society of Physicists made against it. But he is having a struggle in MIT just having an engineering forum on the subject, just speaking out and showing that apart from the horrors of war and militarism, this system will not work. And it is $9.5 billion a year that in Eisenhower's famous speech of April 1953 in Washington, where he listed all the weapon systems and how much money, aircraft carrier, airplanes, so on, tanks, and what they would build in terms of clinics and schools and hospitals and public transit. Here it is, the paragon of engineering scientific excellence, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, censoring itself, not willing to jeopardize its contracts for its Lincoln Laboratory and its connections with Rethinking, etc., to have an academic, open analysis of the pros and cons of the missile defense system. When I was going after General Motors, I went to some universities for technical help. I found out there were no PhDs in automotive engineering, that the auto companies didn't want PhDs in automotive engineering. They wanted to hire engineers out of college and, quote, teach them the industry way, end quote. They would not support auto safety research at all. At MIT, where GM had a very close connection, or Caltech, or any other university. They wanted to control the development of automotive technology in such a way that it was a responder to the marketing strategy of emphasizing style and horsepower over safety. And so technology stagnated decade after decade as millions of people would be killed or injured in otherwise preventable crashes. The seatbelt was available before World War I. It didn't get to the cars until the 60s. In our country, Volvo had it in the 50s. In Sweden, the airbag was developed in 1952-53. It was standard equipment for about 40 years later. The head restraints, padded dash panels, that stuff goes back to Roman chariot days. How much lead time do we have to give GM? So we start out with the following principle. Democracy is for people. It's for human beings. It's not for artificial entities like corporations. And yet, in our country, and true in your country, corporations have almost all the rights that human beings have. In our country, they have all the constitutional rights except the right against self-incrimination. It's pretty hard to get a corporation on witness stand saying General Motors takes the Fifth Amendment. Now, there is a discussion in the States increasingly as to why corporations have equal rights when they're not human beings, they don't die in Iraq, they don't vote, they don't have children, they don't bleed, they're like robots. They don't even have the feel and touch of a robot. Lawyers call them legal fictions. We're not talking about employees and officers, the corporate entity. And so more and more, we're hearing people in the country calling for what I would term a double standard. That the corporation, with its monistic, avaricious commercial value system, must be structurally, legally, politically subordinated to the sovereignty of the people. That means that corporations should be stripped of their right to enter politics, to influence politics, to make campaign contributions, to give testimony, stripped of their right. They're not human beings. And otherwise, democracy will be submerged under a conglomeratization of dynamic, creative commercialism, the likes of which our forebears would never have imagined in their wildest dreams. In the United States, corporations now can patent life forms under genetic engineering. That means that subject to the restriction of slavery, they can patent genetically engineered life forms, bacteria, animals, all the way up to the humanoid level, until the humanoid level is defined as a person. Already, corporations have thousands of patents on human genomes, sequences. Monsanto is not allowed to have slaves and to own them, but it's allowed to own genes. While we go about our daily business as human beings, family, job, some recreation, it's actually pretty routine when you look back on it. You can say, you know, grandma, grandfather's time were different because they didn't have the technology we have. But the rhythm of daily life is pretty similar. Maybe a little faster. It's meeting the necessities of daily life. Corporations are incredibly dynamic. They are incredibly creative in terms of brokering power, building power, networking power, co-opting power, getting into the minds of our little children, for which they spend a lot of money to do that. That produces what in athletics is called a mismatch. We are not growing our democracy with the intensity and complexity to keep up with the corporate world. In the United States, there are only 3 little groups. I don't think their whole budget is more than $2 million. Monitoring biotechnology. Biotechnology in North America is developing without a legal and ethical framework. There isn't even a requirement to label genetically engineered foods in your supermarket, thanks to Monsanto and its allies, even though 90% of the American people want it. Changing the nature of nature is not modest ambition. That's biotechnology. Possibly the most tumultuous, non-warfare technology the world will ever see. I mean, after all, look what's involved. Controlling the gene pool of flora, fauna, and human biology. 3 little groups. No legal framework, no regulatory framework, and really no ethical framework other than a few conferences. The mass of the people don't even know how to evaluate it, which is one reason why they're suspicious of it. Because the technology hurtled forward way, way ahead of our democratic institutions and our civic institutions. In fact, it hurtled forward ahead of the science of biotechnology, which should be disciplining the technology. It's way ahead. It's been deployed. It's in all kinds of products. And science has still not resolved the problems of migration, you know, when a farmer has genetically engineered crops next to other farmers who don't, and all kinds of interactions with the ecology. It's like the automobile technology was deployed for 60 years, from 1890 so-and-so until the mid-20th century, before the science of photochemical smog was discovered, connecting automobile pollution to air pollution, to photochemical smog in Los Angeles, for example. It's a long time in terms of the gap. Nanotechnology is now the biggie, coming on fast. You can't see it. It may be in your hair pretty soon. It may be detecting everything, listening to everything. It's already in 500 products. It's going to be a $100 billion industry before the decade is out, maybe even more. No legal, no ethical framework. It can be used for espionage. It can be used for civilian purposes. Its benefits are touted. Its risks are muted because it's being pursued for profit. You don't talk about risks of technology if you're a company selling it. And it's run by a corporation whose principal animation, singularly driven, is profit, which is not exactly reflective of the broad value system of human society. And it's one reason why every major religion, thousands of years ago, every major religion warned its adherents not to give too much power to the merchant class, as they called it then. Because the merchant class is singularly motivated to pursue power through profit. And if it lies as must against other value systems, health, safety, tolerance, posterity, concern, access to justice, it will trample them, distort them, divert them, co-opt them, whatever is necessary to keep the juggernaut moving. Now, where do you think all these major religions got this idea? How did they come to the same conclusion? I suspect it was not from revelation. It was from experience. We've lost that level of caution. So when people talk about spiritual values and moral values, if they talk about those in too abstract a strata, if they talk about those too generally, they're going to distance the application of those values from controlling the commercial values, so they are servants, and they obey the far, far more important values of a civilized society. I once wrote a speech, which I gave at the National Press Club 40 years ago, and I just wanted to get the audience thinking, and it's during the Vietnam War. And I said, do you ever ask yourself what Exxon's, was Standard Oil, I guess then, or Esso, what General Motors' position is on the Vietnam War? Have you ever asked yourself what Pfizer Pharmaceuticals company's position is on the Pentagon budget? Or on the budget to safeguard the national forests? We never think of that, do we? You see how they escape? They have enormous power to affect our future and our present, but they're not held to the same evaluative standards that human beings would be held to. They want to be persons under the law, these corporations, so they can get all the rights we have, but they don't want to be evaluated as persons. They get a pass. Nobody ever asks. Other than, yeah, Halliburton, what's Halliburton's position on Iraq in the war? It's called contracts. When was the last time a major corporation took a stand for disarmament? When was the last time a corporation took a stand for decommercializing education? When was the last time a corporation took a stand demanding that the country convert to solar energy? See, we don't ask corporations these things. Even though, who do you think is the biggest player on energy policy in the United States? Corporations. Health policy, corporations. Technology policy, corporations. Electoral policy, money and politics, corporations. We can have a two-party elected dictatorship in our country without corporations. Who do you think shapes the banking industry? Who do you think puts their appointees in high government positions? The Treasury Department, the Defense Department, the Interior Department, the Agriculture Department. Corporations. Who do you think is the greatest source of money in politics? Corporate interests. Who has the most lobbyists? There are about 1,500 citizen lobbyists full-time in Washington. 35,000 corporate lobbyists. And they're all connected with auto dealers, insurance agents, all around the country. Huge, huge network. 1,500 corporations get their way with 535 members of Congress, Senate, and House, and we're millions of people watching American Idol. 3-4 million people could control Congress. Organize Congress watchdog clubs in each congressional district. You call them ridings. In every riding in Canada, every district in the United States, I guarantee you, you've got bridge clubs, poker clubs, bowling leagues, birdwatcher associations. Do you have Parliament watchdog clubs? I tell people who say, oh, you can't do anything, they control everything. You know how people make excuses for themselves? Boy, they're good at that. I said, well, what do you mean? These corporations, they control everything. Well, they don't have a single vote, do they? Not yet, anyway. And who got the votes? You've got the votes. Why aren't you organized? Why don't you quadruple the muscle of all the citizen groups in Canada trying to improve your country? Well, that's, they get into this whatever will be, que sera, sera. It's a mindset like you have these people in a huge stadium. And some guy is standing on a platform, and he's bellowing out, what's the difference between ignorance and apathy? And they all roar back, we don't know, and we don't care. See? And yet, what you like about Canada, what we like about the United States, is traced back through 200, 250 years to people just like ourselves who started out with no power against the powers that be and created power. Because they didn't make excuses for themselves. Because they didn't look the other way. Because they didn't keep saying, I'm too busy, I'm too preoccupied. They faced up to it. That is the first source of civic motivation, our forebears, what they did. Canada is in an accelerating state of depreciation of those assets that you inherited. And the same in our country. You can see it in our country in the decline of public libraries and their maintenance and their budgets. You see it in the decline of public works that were built with tax money, crumbling clinics, crumbling schools. Beyond belief. You got crumbling schools? Come to the United States, I'll show you rubble. The district library system in Washington, D.C., they have bullet holes through their windows, haven't been repaired for a year or two. We have the photographs. We got them repaired when we gave them the photographs. The budget was $27 million for 27 branches in the main library in the nation's capital, rated the worst library system of any city in the United States. And they're building a $650 million tax fund baseball stadium because Montreal couldn't fill its stands. We got it. And this stadium is being built on time, no problems, and the schools are crumbling, the clinics are crumbling, libraries are crumbling. This isn't ancient Rome and Colosseum. At least during the days of ancient Rome and the Colosseum, they let the people in free. The taxpayer build a stadium and then they gouge the fans. And these billionaire sports corporations are laughing all the way to the bank. When I was a boy, if any baseball, football, or hockey team came to the city hall and said, we want you to build a stadium, they'd have been laughed out of town. See the deterioration. So the first motivation comes from the history of valor and courage. And let me tell you, what your farmers did and what our farmers did in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we should be ashamed of ourselves by making excuses for ourselves. These farmers came out after the railroads and the banks with nothing but poverty and mind, heart, and feet. And they came after what was then the Goliath of corporate society, the big banks and the big railroads. And he started the most fundamental reform political movement, at least in the United States, starting in 1887, before it peaked in 1912 or so. They elected governors, senators, developed farm co-ops, all kinds of political reforms, almost elected president. They didn't make excuses for themselves. They organized 200,000 farmers with $1 due per farmer. That's $50 today. They were poor in East Texas in 6 months. Called them lecturers. They go around knocking on doors. They had no electricity, no motor vehicles, no internet, they didn't even have email, no telephone. So what history does is convey a time when it was really much more overwhelming because we have the internet. We have instant communications. We have all kinds of assets to mobilize and strengthen our democracy. We have all kinds of solutions they never had. Our respective countries are full of problems that we don't deserve and solutions on the shelf that aren't applied. We don't have solutions for housing. We don't have a solution for public transit. We don't have a solution for energy efficiency and converting to renewables. Of course we do. But the reason why we don't close that democracy gap between the solutions on the shelf and the injustices and needs on the ground that aren't being met is because we're not spending a fraction of our time, with few exceptions, many of them here, on our civic responsibilities and civic duties. And I don't just mean informed voting and more parties, more voices and choices. I mean between elections. You can't have a daily democracy without daily citizenship. We don't grow up civic. If we're not careful, we grow up corporate. We look at the world through corporate eyes, just the way people looked at automobiles in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. Style, power. They didn't get the information. They didn't have the alternative car companies to say you also have to look at fuel efficiency, pollution control, ease of maintenance and repair, and safety. Our evaluation of the economy is corporate. When we hear our leaders say the Canadian economy is in good shape, or Chairman Greenspan of the Federal Reserve, he would go up to Congress, he'd say, the state of the economy is good. And I would say, watching him on TV, good for who? Good for who? All they look at are aggregate economic growth data. They don't look at where it's distributed and what its quality is. And so 80% of the American people are not making an inflation-adjusted income, but they were making 1973, which is the peak year for our country, in our history, of real wages. 1973. Even though the economy has doubled in normal GDP measurements per capita since then. But it's top 1%, top 5% that gets huge percentage of the gains, symbolized by hundreds of thousands of Walmart workers in the United States making $7, $8, $9, $10 an hour, while the CEO makes, what do you think? An hour, 8 hours a day. What do you think? $11,000 an hour. It adds up, doesn't it? In fact, the guy who made $1.5 billion last year, I'm trying to figure how can this be conveyed? You know, what is $1.5 billion? Well, it's almost the budget of our national parks, but that doesn't convey it. So I have to go down the sensuality ladder, if you forgive me. January 2, 9 a.m. He and his executive secretary show up for work. 30 seconds later, he feels bowel movement coming on. He goes to the men's room. He takes care of nature, washes his hands, comes back to the office, 9:11 a.m., January 2. He's made more than his executive secretary will make in a year. And what did he produce? It's not like, he discovered a cure for cancer. These guys are making money from money. The old robber barons in our country's history, they at least produced something, right? They produced cars. They produced textiles. But they didn't make anywhere near the money, even adjusted for inflation, that these guys are making from money. Now, where is all this money coming from that they're making money from in hedge funds and other speculative activities that really don't meet human necessities? They don't even supply capital for productive purposes. It's like a whirling computer machine. It comes heavily from labor union pension money, rich people money, and increasingly university endowments like Harvard, Yale. And yet all over our country, there's a desperate need for productive capital. Just look at the scene as you travel around on highways. Look at the housing stock. Look at the American Society of Civil Engineers that say just to repair our public works is $2-3 trillion. So it's not going. There's a mismatch here as well. So the first motivation is the forebears. What's the second motivation? Because this is what it really comes down to. People know what the SOAR is. They may not know it in the detail of David K. Johnston or Naomi Klein or Jim Harding. But, they know. You ask most people who don't really spend much time reading the papers, they know who runs their country. They know they're being gouged. They know their taxes are going to wealthy and the powerful more and more. But there needs to be a self-respect level. You see, if people don't have a higher estimate of their own significance, if they don't feel they matter, if they don't feel they count, if they don't feel they have the citizen skills, so they go down to the public meeting and nobody can shout them down, and parliamentary rules of order and all that, they are going to be viewed as apathetic because they view themselves as powerless. Two sides of the same coin. Two different sides of the same coin. What are our schools teaching? If they don't teach civic skills, if they don't weave the various subjects together, politics, economics, home economics, mathematics, they don't weave them together into ability of the individual to look ahead and feel that he or she has got the skills to form coalitions, to hold a news conference, to resist being discouraged, to learn how to develop strategy and tactics in pursuing a noble objective. They're going to basically fodder. They're going to be spokes in a giant corporate wheel. And their expectation levels will be frozen, if not reduced, except for the desire to make a little better livelihood. But their civic expectation levels will be non-existent. So the level here of getting into our schools something other than a kind of trade school mentality where we've got to get these kids with computer skills. They have to be computer literate. Also, it'll for literacy. But if they're computer skills, what about civic skills? The most important skills they'll ever have. And years ago, my trips to Canada, I would learn more and more about your country. And the more I learned about your country, the more I learned about in how many areas you were first in the world or in North America. For example, you brought credit unions to New England, and now we have 60 million Americans who belong to credit unions. You had the first radio station, first oil well, children's museum, you know, cultural first, technical first, social first. You certainly led the way with full Medicare in North America. Here, too, started here. Remember, I was just told, it wasn't just Tommy Douglas. With the farmers who really laid the groundwork for health care, for collective health care, here in Saskatchewan. Something we often forget. Anyway, I would, just for fun, I'd say to my Canadian friends, tell me where Canada was first. And, you know, they'd give me a drug or two, a sport or two, hockey and some. And they had this peplum, you know, they always would come up with that. And I'd count them, you know, I'd say 1, 2, 3. Almost never it would cross 18 or 19. I say to myself, if I was in Texas and I asked that question of Texans, who would make them up after they finished 1,000? Canadians are so modest. So Duff Conacher and my niece and I decided to put a little book together called Canada First. So we had a manuscript, sent it to various Canadian publishers, all turned down. So why are you turning it down? The Canadians aren't interested where they're first. They're so modest about things. It wouldn't sell. So on the second go-around, we got Clement Stewart to publish in 1992 or so. And it became a 42-week paperback bestseller. But it's still not in schools. Some of your schools teach more about U.S. history, it seems, than Canadian history. So it is very important to motivate people so they don't have secondary consciousness and inferiority consciousness collectively as well as individually. Third source of motivation comes from concern for posterity. That's not a word you hear much anymore. But in our 18th century, they used that a lot, the political leaders, posterity, future, children, grandchildren. And, you know, the thing people should fear the most inside family, other than illness, is sometime down the road, that 9-year-old sitting on grandma or grandpa's knee and pointing some disaster in the world and looking into the eye of the grandparent and say, what were you doing when this all was building up? You know, global warming or something. What are you going to say? And what are they going to say? They're busy watching the second rerun of Cheers? That's a tough thing. And it's important to make it tough. It's important that we are so concerned about posterity's judgment of us that we start reordering our priorities and recognizing that we can't continue to make excuses for ourselves. Or when you try to call people up to go to a meeting, it's like pulling teeth, but it's in your own interest. You've said these are problems. You've got to go. You've got to do something about it. I'm too busy. I'm afraid to go to public and say something and not know what the ordinance says. Or, don't worry, we have people. 101 excuses. And you're not asking them to accept your definition of injustice. All you're doing is reflecting what you've heard them complain about constantly. Now, what also fuels motivation, it's all about civic motivation. The knowledge is here, the information is way more than we're using. People say, oh, the mass media is concentrated, and Canada is concentrated in the U.S. But if you want to get information now, you can get faster and cheaper than ever before. Not just Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Or the occasional great expose on TV news or feature. It's all those websites you have, specialized websites. After a while, you can pretty qualify them in terms of their reliability and their accuracy. So it isn't a matter of not getting enough information. It is a matter that the mass media doesn't cover civic activity the way it should. They'll expose something, citizens try to do something about it, they'll freeze them off the airwaves. But its motivation comes from learning about our forebears, our self-respect, and our concern for posterity. But it also helps to have more detailed knowledge, because more detailed knowledge about injustice is infuriating. And you have to be infuriated to get your intelligence moving. Lots of smart engineers knew about auto safety defects. They weren't infuriated. Lots of academics know about all kinds of fraud, if they're banking professors, if they're insurance professors, or whatever, pharmaceutical. They're not infuriated. You have to have fire in your belly to illuminate and release the energy of your mind. That doesn't mean you go haywire and you lose control of yourself and you sputter, but it means that if some of your classmates were killed in car crashes, because cars were not built for crashworthiness, you get infuriated. I got infuriated. And I started searching and researching. And a verdict of guilty was on the back of General Motors, Ford and Chrysler, and VW at that time. The more detail we know. And so what is this WTO? What is this NATO or NAFTA? This is a strategy by global corporations to put a layer of international autocratic governance on our sovereignties, national, provincial, local, and subordinate our consumer, environmental, and labor values to the imperatives of commercial international trade. That's the design. And up until WTO, these trade agreements really were not enforceable. I mean, we could thumb our nose at them. We were supposed to. We signed them. But they didn't have any sanction. What WTO and NAFTA introduced was an enforcement arm. An enforcement arm where if we had what is considered too good auto safety standards, food labeling standards, chemical control in the workplace standards, some other country that belongs to WTO can come along and take our country or your country to Switzerland in those secret tribunals, literally. They don't even allow the press in the courtroom of the World Trade Organization, and say, that Canadian law, that U.S. law, that's restricting our exports to those countries, and that is GATT illegal, that's WTO illegal. And they're going to win. Because the structure of WTO and NAFTA is not to stick to trade in goods. It's to subordinate consumer values, health and safety, worker safety, and environmental to the supremacy of trade. So it isn't trade that has to get on its knees in front of those tribunals and prove that they're not damaging your health, they're not giving you cancer, they are not endangering the workplace, they are not polluting your lungs. It's the reverse. It is the reverse of how our countries progressed, by subordinating commercial values to human values, like abolishing child labor. What WTO and NAFTA did was to make consumer, environmental, and worker standards to get on their knees and have to prove that they're not affecting the imports from other countries that may have very weak consumer, environmental, and worker standards, like China. Think of what a revolution it was. That is a silent coup d'etat of monumental proportions, designed by drug companies, the auto companies, the oil companies. They were all in it with their lawyers, and they got their government allies together, and they made it very complex and very secretive, and they rammed it through the Parliament and through our Congress. They even got Clinton to push it through Congress without allowing any amendments. It's called fast track. No amendments, limited debate. They debated more about the pay increase in the House of Representatives than they did for WTO. Now, it just so happened there were polls of the American people on it. And consistently, a majority were opposed to it. They were opposed to it because they had this feeling that it was tough enough to deal with Albany and Washington. How are they going to deal with Geneva? They had this feeling that more and more of control over their lives was becoming more and more remote, was being in the hands of international bureaucrats. No accountability, no openness. They felt more and more distant from the forces controlling it. And those who spent a little time reading about it knew how that architecture really was. That was designed to subordinate our political sovereignty to the imperatives of international trade. Now, let's say Canada thumbs its nose at a country. Let's say Canada thumbs the nose at Brazil, because Canada has a tough food labeling law, and Brazil wants to export food to Canada, and it thinks it's burdensome to have to label all this food. So Brazil takes Canada to Geneva, and your attorneys, your whatever you call your attorney general, goes there to defend Canada, and the Brazilian attorney general goes to prosecute Canada as a petitioner. He will lose, because that's the way those trade agreements are written. Because they will show that your food labeling is not least trade restrictive. Instead of labeling the products in the supermarket, you could have had signs in the supermarket that were less restrictive. This is an actual argument made by. There are hundreds of laws in Canada, U.S., Japan, and Western Europe that are GATT or WTO illegal, but they haven't yet been pushed to adjudication by the challenging nations. This is a creeping coup d'etat. If you enforce WTO and NAFTA to the hilt, it would destroy themselves. People wouldn't tolerate it. But nibble by nibble, chunk by chunk. 5 of our environmental health regulations have been challenged. 5 times we went to Geneva as a country. 5 times we lost. Now, what's the enforcement mechanism? Either we have to repeal our laws and regulations when we lose in Geneva, or we have to pay compensation to the country at one case until we comply with the decision. Now, you would think the Canadian and American people would have had to vote for something like this. This is quite surrender. This is the greatest surrender of sovereignty in our respective histories. But the courts have hand off. They won't take these cases. And now we're witness to Mexican trucks about ready to come to the U.S. without adequate statistical data about their drivers and companies, and without any assurance that they're going to be maintained as properly, or the drivers are going to have a record as stringent as they have to have in the U.S. And we know that the record of Mexican trucks in Mexico has been not good in terms of crashes, in terms of 18-year-old drivers who don't know how to drive the rig. Now, because of NAFTA, the trucks will be coming into the United States, presumably into Canada, and the drivers are being paid $12 to $15 a day. Passing drivers are paid $30 an hour. Would you let New Brunswick revoke the Canadian minimum wage and drag all the industry into New Brunswick because all they pay their people are $2 an hour? You never allow that. Why are we allowing a communist dictatorship in China to do that? Because corporations want it. There's no safety net when you have world trade without world law. There's no safety net when you allow the costs of moving to China, labor costs and arrest, to be dictated by a dictator. There's no free trade with the dictatorship because the dictator controls so many of the costs, not the marketplace. Chinese workers are thrown in jail if they try to start independent trade unions. All kinds of controls by the Chinese government keep the costs of U.S. and Canadian multinationals down. It's not the market. It's the dictators. The access to the courts, the ease of polluting, the tradition of bribery. It's not the marketplace. And yet it's the free market ideology that has imprisoned the mind of so many people in the press and in our government. But that is changing. We now see that the theory of comparative advantage, you took Economics 101. Remember that example they would give in the 18th century? British textiles or Portuguese wine. Portuguese know how to produce wine efficiently. Britain must produce textiles. Both win. That's the theory of comparative advantage when they trade that like that. Now we have absolute advantage. The U.S. can open up in China, U.S. corporations. They use Chinese labor, 50 cents an hour, etc. Brand new equipment, modern management, and a straight shot across the Pacific to the richest market in the world. You can't compete against that. And the evidence is the decline in manufacturing jobs, the decline in white-collar jobs are on the way now, outsourcing, anything that can be transmitted through software, whether it's legal work, accounting work, computer design, architectural work, you name it, can be outsourced to India and China. In fact, it already is, starting. Now, there's some real free traders, prominent economists in the U.S. who are changing their minds. How wonderful. Up to then, they could have defined their profession as a triumph of theory over facts. Paul Samuelson wrote the textbook for millions of college students, changing his mind. Alan Linder, prominent professor of economics at Princeton, estimates that in the next 20 years, the U.S. can lose 40 million jobs. That's almost a third of the existing job force. 24%, 27, 20%, let's say, the job force. And then we have former president of the American Economic Association, William Baumol, who's basically saying that it's one thing to trade where you send things that are low-skilled labor to poor countries who have cheap labor. But now, China, India, they can do anything we do. The most sophisticated electronics, the most sophisticated this and that. And that changes the equation. And so there's a book out by Mr. Baumol, as well as former vice president of IBM, that's trying to say we have to change the system of international trade and investment to take this into account. And one way is to require a balanced trade. That is, right now, for every dollar of goods we sell to China, we buy about 4 or 5 back. And so, increasingly, China and Japan own hundreds of billions of dollars of treasury bonds here in this country, in our country. And because there's no balanced trade. We now have gone 28 straight years of international trade deficit. Where's the breaking point? When are these free traders going to say, gee, 28 years, that's a factual statement. Maybe it isn't a win-win situation. And the deficits are huge. This year, they will go past $800 billion. $800 billion we're buying from abroad more than we're selling. We have a trade deficit with your country. And so that's the coming debate. I don't know if they'll come fast enough. But I do know that there are a lot of hollowed out communities in America, a lot of unemployed workers, aged 50, 60, who have nothing left, not even McDonald's jobs to sustain them. And in America, if you stop looking for a job after 6 months because you couldn't find one, you're not considered unemployed. So you're not part of the unemployment statistic. So what we're seeing here is a challenge to our democratic practices. We want to control our own country with our own people. If we want to do something about international consumer protection, like the price of medicines, we have international consumer treaties. If we want to deal with the environment, we have environmental treaties. If we want to deal with worker rights, like the ILO standards, we should have international treaties. We should not allow a trade treaty to embrace and subordinate the consumer, labor, and environmental values and standards of our country. But that's what the coup d'etat did. It did stick to trade. It basically took over these three important categories. And it's getting worse because now, under Chapter 11 of NAFTA, if you have a regulation against abuse of a U.S. company in Canada, and there's no similar regulation in the U.S., that U.S. company can take the Canadian government to court and make them pay damages under Chapter 11, a NAFTA court. And the same is true. Some of your companies are suing our country for certain safety regulation. That's how crazy it's gotten. Now, there's a question here to be asked of all of us. If Canada and the U.S. suddenly were dictatorships, how would our daily life change? You know, dictators allow personal freedoms. They allow people to marry who they want to marry, go down and buy something from the store, see a movie, play soccer, call up your friends, travel, for the most part, unless it's some, Burma or something. Most of them allow that. Or the West Bank, Gaza, the Gulag and the prison, the Israeli Gulag and Israeli prison, checkpoints and blockages and so forth. 28% of Palestine is left in the West Bank and Gaza. But most dictatorial regimes, you do all that. But isn't there a distinction between personal freedom and civic freedom? The dictatorships block civic freedom. You can't say what you want politically. You can't vote for who you want. You're not likely to be able to run for office. You can't sue the government. Now, if we don't do these things, if we don't go into the village square and get a rally going, would a dictatorship change our normal daily life? Go to work, spend time with family, play ball, look at video games. It's only when you use your civic rights. It's only when you engage the political system. It's only when you assert yourself as a human being that has a higher purpose than just getting through every day. Because if you have trouble getting through every day because of economic and other constraints, you're going to have more trouble getting through every day if we don't take time out for our civic duties. And if you are not engaged in civic activity, how much would a dictatorship change your daily life? When I was young, I went to the Soviet Union for a visit. It was about 1961. I had this image of the Soviet Union. I was going to land at Moscow airport, and I was going to go into Moscow, and I would see people in chains, surveillance, cops everywhere, right? And so I started walking down the streets in Moscow. Guys would come up to me, and they'd tell me how they went hunting in the Caucasus, or fishing in some river, and how they had fun playing football or soccer or whatever they did. And they went to dances, they went to nightclubs. That's when I first began making this distinction between personal freedom and civic freedom. It's the civic freedom that's going to determine the quality of our personal freedom, of course. But it's also going to determine what kind of future we're going to leave for our children and grandchildren. How we're going to deal with this tormented world of ours where 3 billion people live on $2 or $1 a day, where 1 million children die from contaminated drinking water, or 2 million children, where 1 million kids die from malaria, tuberculosis is killing 2 million people. What's all this modern medicine about? What's all this modern scientific discovery about? What's all this brilliant delivery capability about in terms of transportation systems, communication systems? There are hundreds of millions of people living as if it was the 20th century, the 19th century. We can't together as a world prevent this massive maternal mortality, infant mortality, deal with diseases for which there are preventive remedies. It's like we're paralyzed. And what is life's gratification about? Senator Daniel Webster said in 1830, justice is the great work of human beings on earth. Without justice, there's no liberty, freedom. Justice not going to be given us from the top. It's something we get ourselves. That certainly is a lesson of history. Corporate globalization is the new tyranny. It's coming on step after step. People are being told by Western drug companies, pay or die in the third world. Of course, they say that to U.S. people, too. You know how many Americans die every year, according to the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, with a conservative, prestigious outfit? 18,000 Americans die every year because they can't afford health care. Hundreds of thousands get sick or are not diagnosed in time to prevent their illness. It's a pay or die situation. So when the Fraser Institute and their propagandists and U.S. health insurance companies, drug companies come to you and say you've got to change your system, I think you know what you should tell them. Well, let me end on this note, and we can have a discussion if you like. I'm sure that you exposed yourself to a lot of renditions of injustice and all the things we should be doing. But somehow there's a feeling that after the session is over, you sort of walk away and it's back to the routine or to a sense of futility. Because sometimes when a picture of injustice, of power with accountability is painted, it makes people get discouraged. They get overwhelmed and they withdraw instead of motivate them. So let me say that when you're trying to motivate people to be more active here, you consider the question of civic personality and how to develop it. It's good to develop it early in school by civic projects of students, of their teachers in the community, learn by doing. But the civic personality, you can spot this in everyone who's successful in civic action. They have a certain personality, just like in sports. You know, if you look at basketball, the hockey teams, there's always one or two that are real superstars. But you know, there are a lot of hockey players who are physically just as talented, but they're not superstars. And the difference is the athletic personality, will to win, like Michael Jordan, the will to win. You don't clutch in the last minute. You don't get nervous. It's the will to win. Well, the civic personality is similar to this. It's a personality that keeps informed, that has a high estimate of its own significance without being too much hubris. It's a personality that will give other people credit, not hog the credit that they're working with. It's a personality that is not sensitive to moonbeams, blistered by moonbeams. You know, these personal interactions with people, and I don't like the tone of your voice. You know, my theory is that if we had a perfect democracy, the biggest obstacle to success would be personality clashes between people, you know. They have nothing really to do with the mission. The civic personality wants to learn skills, just the way people in business want to learn sales skills and marketing skills. The civic personality, more often than not, will replace small talk with big talk and make it interesting. Can you imagine small talk on cell phones these days? The civic personality is resilient. The last mistake is the best teacher. The civic personality doesn't get discouraged. The civic personality does not know the meaning of pessimism because pessimism has no function, no purpose. It's written out. The civic personality is one that is persistent. You got to lose and lose and lose before you win. That's the history of social justice. How many times the anti-slavery people lose? The women's right to vote or the workers' rights movement. Persistence and endurance. Taken all together, a great way to go through life. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We can have a discussion, announcement of pending meetings. You want? Questions, suggestions? Don't hesitate to announce pending meetings. Remember, Democracy Watch is dwatch.ca.
We have a mic over here for questions.
Not questions, of course. We don't ask questions to get informed. We talk to you know how well informed we are. it's too easy to give too much power to the corporations. They only have the power we cede to them. In this province you're talking about, we had an Alan Blakeney. Alan Blakeney took over the potash mines. A few years later, we had a peak in oil prices such as we have now. And we had a premier in Alberta, Peter Lougheed, with Alan Blakeney, and we had Lucky Pierre in Ottawa. They joined together and took the excess profits from the oil companies. We can do this anytime we want. And if we wanted to, we would look at the fact that the present government here, which is likely very acquiescent, was elected by less than 22 people out of every 100 of voting age. 44 people didn't vote. So every time you ask somebody if they voted and they say no, you slap them alongside the head. We've never had an opportunity here and in the States to take back the power and mold the world we want like we have it now. Because there's no strong opposition. There's our own indifference. That's the opposition. There you see, now I'll go away now.
Hi. So just in the interest of being a citizen, I'm kind of nervous getting up here and doing this, but there is a thought that I've had that I want to share, maybe to people's infuriation factor, some of what you've been talking about the
Can you get close to the mic?
Yeah. Just a thought that I had that I want to share with people, to up the infuriation factor that you were talking about, to get people motivated. And that is that I don't think the WTO and other transnational organizations are simply subordinating democracy. I think another way of thinking about it, or an additional way of thinking about it, is that they're actually commercializing democracy. Because when a nation's law is struck down, a nation always has a choice to respect their law, but for that you have to pay sanctions. So for example, people in Europe are paying millions of dollars not to eat our hormone-treated beef. So if you think about that, it isn't just a subordination of democracy, but we can pay to exercise, or we have to pay to exercise our democratic rights. And I think when you think about that, it's pretty infuriating that corporations are actually making money off of our right to exercise our own democracy. So for
yes,
that's
another point, important point to make on corporate globalization. You have to pay tribute. It's another way of putting it. I'm going to call it tribute. Also, under the harmonization provisions of WTO, we can't be first. I mean, we couldn't have been first with airbags in the United States. They have to go through harmonization procedures and committees of the WTO with other countries, which tend to be lowest common denominator. Because if we did go with airbags by ourselves, it would be considered a trade restrictive move and subject to challenge. By the way, all this is very clearly detailed in our website, citizen.org. And when we go to citizen.org, go to Global Trade Watch. Global Trade Watch. We worked a lot with Canadians to block the multilateral proposed treaty on investment, which have been the one that would pair with products like selling cars. This would be investments across borders. That would have been really devastating to a lot of our laws requiring certain investment in low-income areas for housing, for example. That would be considered discriminatory. And we worked with people in Canada on it, Maud Barlow and others. But our website on that, which is really up to date, is a magnificent website on globalization, corporate globalization, is go to citizen.org and then go to the Global Trade Watch. Yes.
This city is experiencing a bit of a housing boom right now. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the U.S. housing bubble that's currently bursting, the credit crunch that's going on right now, because I think it
the willful overextension of credit to people who want to buy homes under deceptive practices. So it was really sleazy that they hooked these people, so you don't have to have any money down, and you don't have to pay the interest for a while, etc., all kinds of mortgage instruments. And so they got in over their heads, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. Maybe 2-3 million people will lose their homes in the United States in the next year or two. And the Federal Reserve and the powers that be are trying to contain the spread of this ripple that has even reached banks in Asia and in England. In fact, I run on a British bank recently. You wonder, how could that be related to the subprime mortgage bubble in the U.S.? Well, because they securitize these mortgages. It isn't like the old days, you get a mortgage from your little bank down the street and it would stay there. No, they sell them off, and they sell them off, who sells them off? And so they go all over the world in like securities, like stocks. And it can topple. Once it topples, it becomes like a domino effect. Nobody knows how serious it's going to be yet. As my father used to ask us, why will capitalism always survive? And his answer was, because socialism will always be around to save it. That's exactly what happens. Every time these big companies are, so greedy they're ready to hit the country in a depression or recession, it's the national government. Some bail them out, all kinds of ways. We call it corporate welfare. Huge. Half of Washington is shoveling out all kinds of corporate welfare. Yes.
just to give you a sense of something's coming up, November 1st, actually in the same room, Maud Barlow is coming to Regina with the next talk on the water covenant. So.
Corporatization of public water systems. Yeah, she was a pioneer on that.
Your book in 1965, Unsafe Any Speed, resulted in a number of design changes to automobiles to make them a lot safer than they had been. I'd be interested to know your opinion about the auto industry today, especially when it comes to safety and pollution.
Well, the auto companies go into waves. When regulations come and they mean business, they comply with them. But in the process, they try to take over the Department of Transportation so that it doesn't issue any more regulations or update them. So there are basically two stages from 1968 to about 71, and from 1976 to 1980. There were advances, and then the airbag standard later on. But there's a big backlog of auto safety and pollution control and fuel efficiency innovations that have been developed by the auto suppliers, and they can't get the auto manufacturers to adopt them. The most innovative part of the automotive industry is now the big suppliers. So we can have 50 mile a gallon cars. We can have cars that can hit a fixed barrier at 60 miles an hour and you can walk away with very minor injuries. And we can have different combustion systems or more efficient combustion systems, which means less pollution from the vehicle. But the regulatory impetus is dead now. I mean, it's really not doing virtually asleep in Washington, whether Democrat or Republican. The only change is that we got through Congress some mandates, so they have to deal with rollover standards. And the Department has to issue rollover standards. This is what I mean. The corporations are at it 24/7. They're relentless. They have resources. And citizen groups get tired, get parted out. They get overwhelmed. So we need more citizen groups. We need more people. You know, we need a fraction of the people who are bird watchers, my favorite analogy. I wish there were 1/10 of the Congress watchers in our country that are bird watchers.
Over the years, you've been insulted in many ways by the media and just slammed, and I personally have been called swine by a right-wing Saskatchewan radio personality. I just wondered, like, where do you find that personal strength to not to take on the chin all these insults the right throws at you? I just wonder how you persevere through that personally.
Well, first, I evaluate merits of the insults. Second, actually, I'm always asked that question, so that's one of the reasons I just written this book, The 17 Traditions, which is how my mother and father raised their 4 children in a small factory town in Connecticut in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it's actually supposed to be out on the table today, but you get it off online, HarperCollins. You'll see the answers to that question. I mean, we were raised in a very low-key, but very incisive way to correlate freedom with civic duty. And my mother and father taught us by example. They were very active in the community. And just little moments, and we're trying to get a lot of families everywhere to put down their own family traditions, great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, before it's too late. Because most families have insights, wisdom, and experiences that are very important to transfer to the children and grandchildren. But they don't put them down. And so they're gone forever. Grandmother's gone forever. Anyway, I came home one day. I was 10 years old, and I came home from school. My father said to me, "What did you learn in school today, Ralph? Did you learn how to believe or did you learn how to think?" What do you think that was worth in credits? So we had the tradition of learning how to listen. My mother would say, if you talk all the time, you're never going to learn anything. So learn how to listen. There's a tradition of health, a tradition of simple enjoyments. They didn't overload us with goods and so on. So we learned to value what we had. A tradition of work, tradition of patriotism, which to them, and they were immigrants, was not flag-waving. It was improving the level of justice in your society. And watching my father talk about this in the restaurant with all kinds of people, it's just a fantastic civics course. It just, that's where it comes from. So you ask, how do I take it? I mean, I don't lose any sleep over this. I do try to analyze the information base of these insults, or whatever you call them. And a lot of times, it's willful. I mean, they know better. But it's a show. It's entertainment. It's Bill O'Reilly, you know. It's Sean Hannity. It's the soliloquist of the United States, Rush Limbaugh. I mean, they're catering to a particular crowd of rigid ideology, and they're being paid very handsomely by the corporate advertisers to keep eating up on government and not corporations. But the most difficult criticism is by people who agree with you but think that the two parties own all the voters, and how dare you challenge the Democratic Party, which has become more and more corporatized every year. And these are the people who are really in a trap of least worst voting, and they won't pressure the least worst to do better because they're afraid of the worst getting elected. So the least worst is being pulled in the same direction as the worst by corporate interests, and every 4 years they both get worse. So it's a trap. If you are going to go for the least worst, as dozens of environmental, women's rights, consumer civil rights groups did in 2004, you at least should try to make care better by pulling into your viewpoints. You don't say, well, I'm really against the war in Iraq. We're not going to have any more mass rallies in 2004 because we don't want to embarrass Kerry and have the Republicans call Kerry soft on defense or terror. And in the meantime, Kerry became more belligerent on the first debate. He was very, very hawkish. Even was praised by the Wall Street Journal editorial for being really hawkish. It's because the anti-war groups gave him a holiday. And my point is, if all these groups believe in what they're espousing, women's rights, civil rights, environment, consumer, law enforcement against corporate crime, they should believe that these are winning issues. If the Democrats picked up living wage and full health insurance for everyone, they would have easily defeated Bush on the first round. Well, they got more votes in the first round. We have a system where you can come in second and win. That's why we're so good at teaching people about democracy, by force of arms. You can't do it by argument, or by analogy, or by example.
Hi, Ralph. Actually, you answered my question because we're facing a provincial election here coming up in Saskatchewan, and some of us feel torn about our Saskatchewan party versus the NDP party. So I was going to ask you to remind people why it's important to have more than two parties running, and that voting for a party other than the status quo isn't really vote splitting and irresponsible. It's a way to force parties to stand up for really what they believe in. And as you say, if we do choose the less of two evils, we can at least encourage them or push them to stand for real things. So thank you for bringing that up. If you have more to say about it, please do so.
Well, you have to condition your vote. If you tell the least worst choice that you're going to vote for that candidate because that candidate's not as bad as the other, then that candidate's going to take your vote for granted. And if that candidate takes you for granted, you're going to take it. It's just that simple. You've got to make your vote conditional on certain policies, on certain commitments. That's what the corporate interests do in terms of their contributions. They contribute to candidates who want to take them over. So that's really, I mean, if you're going to play the least worst game, which I don't like, because the only vote that's wasted is when you vote for someone you don't believe in. And if you're going to play the least worst game, you have to set a set of demands. And none of these groups, we looked at 19 of these groups supporting Kerry on their website. Not one of them was demanding anything of Kerry. It was anybody but Bush. So what did anybody but Bush get? Bush. If you don't make Kerry better, he gets worse, he blurs, he doesn't draw bright lines with Bush, and people don't like that. People really like bright lines. They like someone who believes what he or she says, even if they don't agree. I've had a lot of people say, I don't believe what Reagan does. I don't like what Reagan says, but I admire it. He believes in it. I've always found this a bizarre evaluation. I don't agree with Bush's devastation and destruction of Iraq, but I really like the way he stands firm on it. It's a real important political virtue. Yeah.
Hello. I guess I'll preface my question with saying I agree with everything that you're saying this evening, but I just have a question. Do you feel that there is a place for corporations in the world in the 21st century? The reason I'm asking that is there have been maybe some people would call them gains, some people would say they're not, but in terms of GMO, increasing yield, increasing quality, preventing disease and so on, so that some areas that could grow crops before can now grow them, and I'm just wondering what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I believe in at the maximum extent local self-reliance, and you become interdependent after you exhaust your local community self-reliance and your provincial self-reliance. You don't go at the beginning for interdependence controlled by multinational corporations, which is really what they want us to be, very interdependent. When we don't have to be that interdependent. For example, interdependent in terms of energy. When we got a huge amount of renewable energy and energy efficiency potential in America. But it doesn't make the oil companies rich, does it? Renewables and energy efficiency. Second is they should be prohibited from participating in the public sphere. They're not human beings, so you cut them back on that area. No politics, no lobby, no campaign contribution. Third, what we own together, what's called the commons, like you call them crown lands, for example, we call them the public lands. All the government research and development that we pay for as taxpayers are huge worker pension funds. We should control what we own. And we don't. We own, but don't control. who controls the corporations. They control the investments, etc. We own the public airways over which TV and radio companies transmit the programs, and they pay us nothing. There's no license fee. There's license, but no license fee for the biggest TV station in New York. They'll get it free. They've got it free since 1927 Radio Act. And so my point is, that's common. We should be able to have our own radio and TV programs, our own audience network. We should have a slice of that 24 hours a day that we give away to the commercial radio and TV stations, and make them pay rent. We're the landlord, we own it, they're the tenants, they don't pay rent now. So we can fund our own stations, our own producers, reporters, programmers, first-rate material for children and adults. That's the second. And the third is that they have to be subjected to the rule of law. Right now, they pretty much control the rule of law. So that means they have to be vulnerable to challenge by taxpayers, consumers, workers, and government. And then fourth, they should not be as large as they are. I mean, I think some of them reach levels of shared monopoly, like ExxonMobil, that is very unhealthy for market discipline. There's so few giant oil companies in America now. All they have to do is tighten refinery capacity by not building more refineries. Even after they've shut them down, they can build them on the same land, which is already polluted. Or when they repair refineries, they delay the re-entry of the refinery, and the gasoline prices shoot up. It's almost automatic. You can shoot up 10, 50 cents in California by shutting down one refinery. That's too much market power. And then finally, we should have other forms of economic organizations, more cooperatives. We should have more ways by which we can deliver goods and services other than to rely on fewer and fewer giant corporations controlling millions of small businesses through franchises.
Thank you very much.
I just want to start off by saying that I'm thankful to be at a university where I can speak and practice my civil responsibilities without being tackled and tasered. I like that. Second of all, I think my education and a lot of the people's education in this room is becoming more and more commercialized. As you were talking about, our university is relying on private funds more and more, and that obviously skews our education. It marginalizes the social disciplines such as humanities and the liberal arts. These are disciplines that teach us our civil responsibilities. These are being pushed aside. How could you give a to-do list for students that we can act on to stop this? Because this has been happening exponentially even in the past 3 years. Take a look at our last president. Thank you.
Well, one thing, this is one thing that your new PERG can work on. That is to get a university policy that draws the line between commercialism and the academy. Right now, and I've talked to a number of university presidents, I asked them, do you have a policy that says this far and no further in terms of joint ventures with companies, in terms of moonlighting by professors, all kinds of things like that? And they don't have it. It's a case by case. That's not good enough. You need to have, the university is one of the three major sources of knowledge production in our society. You have university, you have business, you have government, organized knowledge. And university, in your case mostly public, is not supposed to be driven by commercial priorities in terms of what research they take, what courses they provide to students. They should be more independent judgment. So there needs to be a policy where the line is drawn. We will draw this line, and the commercial world will not intrude on the academic world in this way. Instead, the student loan companies in the States, they would wine and dine and pay for trips to Bermuda for the administrators of the universities like Duke and Columbia, who are dealing with student loans. They had them in their pocket, and they would steer the students to the higher price loans, and not to the Department of Education, for example, which has 25% of the business and has a better deal. So that's what I mean. You have to have that line drawn. And that requires getting together and talking about these things with whoever runs your university. They call them trustees.
Board of directors.
Board of directors, your president, faculty, students, alumni, and talk over. Because look what happened when universities wouldn't challenge the auto companies with independent research, because the controls the auto industry had over the engineering schools. Lots of people died. Lots of auto innovations were not put into practice for decades. So it isn't just academic, so to speak. And also answers the question, what determines the nature of the curriculum, the courses you take? Is it the job market overwhelmingly? Well, it's okay to learn skills at school, accounting, business administration, so on. But there's far more important things you need to learn and experience, what's called the liberal education. And increasingly, schools are becoming trade schools, no matter what their prestigious name is. Law schools are becoming trade schools. Engineering schools become trade schools. They don't have any idea of the broader issues that could animate their profession. They don't even know what the standards of profession are, if you ask them. What's the difference between a profession and a trade? They couldn't even answer. There's no public policy context for learning about nuclear engineering or uranium mining. Here's how you deal with uranium mining, to get the most amount of uranium out. It's not the broader, what is this uranium for? Who is it harming? Who's buying it? Who's using it? Is it necessary? When I went after nuclear power years ago, I tried to summarize it saying it was too hazardous, too costly, too unnecessary, and too intrusive. It wasn't necessary. A fraction of energy efficiency replaced all the nuclear plants in the U.S. I mean, we waste so much energy. It's an art form. I once asked a very prominent physicist, what's the function of an electric generating plant? He said, to heat the heavens. The amount of waste in the propulsion system of cars, it's unbelievable. And we're the two most wasteful countries in the world, Canada and the U.S., of energy. So a megawatt you save is a nuclear-produced megawatt you need. Of course, it's better environmentally, it's better for the family budget, and it's better for posterity. Nuclear power is a form of organized insanity. If you really analyze it, the idea of this complicated, listen to this, in the States, you have these water reactors. You start with the uranium mines, and for decades they had the tailings around the mine, the waste spewing radioactive aerosols in all directions. And then they went and they yellow caked it, and then they fabricated it into the fuel rods, and then they transported it to these nuclear plants with the huge dome, and then they put everything in place, and then they boiled water. Can you imagine if ancient Mesopotamia did that to us? And the result was 300,000 years of radioactive waste, for which they have found no sturdy geological repository, including Yucca Mountain in Nevada. It's just organized insanity. I once talked to the American Psychological Association. I said, I got a whole new horizon for you people. You're talking about personal mental health and insanity? Why don't you try collective insanity? The General Motors, the Pentagon. General Motors got a problem with the toilet train itself. The drug companies can be called kleptomaniacs. The Health Maintenance Organization is suffering from attention deficit disorder. Get them in a hospital and out in 24 hours. That's all it takes to give birth. We have to broaden out here. Whoever controls the yardsticks by which society's activities is measured controls policy. The SAT defines intelligence, gives you a number. You internalize the number, and you go through life ranking yourself with others who have higher or lower numbers, and you get into this or you get into that based on the number. This is ridiculous. It's a systematic form of intellectual fraud. It's now shown that your high school grades and actual assessment tests are much better predictors of how you do than the SAT multiple choice form of fraud. But however, how many millions of students went through life with that number around their neck? Gee, I couldn't do biology. I couldn't be going till I did test that one spring morning, 3 hours, A, B, C, D, none of the above. It's like the ancient Mandarin Chinese 9-legged essay. It's totally crazy. Finally, it's going to be replaced, I think. But they control the yardstick. If they say to you, the Canadian economy is doing very well because you had a 3.5% real economic growth last year, you'll say, yeah, that's pretty good. But if you say, well, did we have a reduction in child poverty? Did we have a reduction in industrial disease and trauma accidents? Did we have a reduction in consumer debt? In other words, if they control the measures of economic progress by just giving you the aggregate data, not the distributional, who benefits, who doesn't, they are controlling the economic dialogue. And it gets right into our economic textbooks. So watch out for the yardstick. When the environmentalists started getting in law yardsticks for measuring industrial factories by the pollution they produce in the air and the water and the soil, didn't dialogue change? Didn't society start moving? But until that happened, do you know what the companies pictured pollution spewing from smokestacks? It was a sign of progress. The factories were open. Workers were working. Look at all that black soot coming out of the smokestack. In fact, it was a tourist card in the 40s from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They would have a steel mill in color, huge soot coming out. Now, I don't think they do that today. If it's, open.
And just caveat my statement, or question, I guess. You're giving your controversial views in the university, arguably controversial views. We're listening to them. So this isn't just an issue for non-students. This is an issue of democracy. And commercialization of our universities, as it played out in the U.S., when the Vagina Monologues was presented in the U.S., the board of directors at the school thought it was distasteful to have vagina placed on the board, so they renamed it the Hoo-Ha Monologues. We're adjusting that. Thank you.
For example, here, there's a gentleman by the name of Don Ching, and I don't have any animus or anything for this gentleman. He's been at least 20 years in public service in Saskatchewan, and most recently the president of SaskTel. We have our own corporation for phone and telecommunications. But one day he is working for the government, and that's Friday. On Monday he is the vice president of one of the large uranium companies, Riva. Here we have a revolving door. We have no legislation to say, for example, even that you have to stay for 2 years, or have a 2-year break. So my question, I'm trying to fit in many things into one question, but maybe you can define government as being part of the commons too, that we're dependent upon.
Well, let me put it this way. Name one burgeoning industry in the United States that hasn't been nourished overwhelmingly by taxpayer-funded government research and development. Pharmaceutical industry, government R&D, biotech, computer industry, aerospace industry, containerization industry, on and on. And these industries brag full-time ads. Look at all these things we've innovated and so on. And a huge portion of research money comes from our tax dollars, and it's given free. It goes to Washington. They develop knowledge, whether through university contracts, their own labs, and so on, and it's given free to these companies. We don't know what we own, therefore, we don't know what we need to control. The idea that our National Institutes of Health can discover Taxol, you know the anti-cancer drug? Is that called Taxol here? Probably another name. It's a major anti-cancer drug. $31 million of tax money to discover and test it through the National Cancer Institute. And it was given free to Bristol-Myers Squibb with no royalties back to the government. And Bristol-Myers was allowed to charge whatever they wanted. So a 52-year-old woman with ovarian cancer lost her job in 2000. She's making $19,000 a year. She didn't have health insurance. She lost her job. She went to her doctor. The doctor said it's a very serious case. The only thing that might be helpful is Taxol. And she said, how much? And he says, $14,000 for 6 treatments. And that was Bristol-Myers research. That was our research being used to profiteer by Bristol-Myers. So that's, I think, what you're referring to. It's something we have to start talking about more. It's really just a matter of, we own it, we're going to control it. We own it, we're going to control it. That's a nice slogan on the campaign trail. It isn't a very radical doctrine. Even conservatives ought to appeal to that. We own it. Don't you think, oh, conservative, don't you think if you own something you should control it? You're darn right. Oh, do I have examples for you?
Just a quick question for you. I was just wondering if you made a conscious decision not to open that bottle of unregulated Coca-Cola tap water.
Yes. I'm actually very parched. I will not drink that Dasani of Coca-Cola. By the way, on your way out, please, if you want Del Connick or Democracy Watch, stay in touch with you. There's a sign-up sheet out there, and he's out there. The more we can get together around good projects. So he's out there, and ask him questions, tell him what's on your mind, and he's got a sign-up sheet. I forgot to mention that. By the way, how many people here have never been to McDonald's? Are you just immigrated, Canada? You've never been? Anyone else? That makes 2 of us. How many of you have never been in a Walmart? Huh? Never been in a Walmart? Hey, you don't believe in these giant chains and stuff they're selling? Like McDonald's is nothing but a fat and sugar factory, pumping stuff into these kids' stomachs with little slogans like, it's a child's world. We think that means to a 9-year-old. Come on, parents, take them down there. You don't patronize them. We try not to patronize them. Starbucks? Anybody not been in Starbucks? You're a tea drinker? Okay. I've never been to Starbucks. Even if the door is open, there's some force field that keeps me out of those places. Yes.
Thank you, and good evening. And may I confidently say I'm the last person in line. I just want to thank you for so succinctly summing up my philosophy of education and teaching in the do you learn how to believe or learn how to think. But may I take this opportunity to say that ARPERG's next meeting is 4:30 on Monday in the Dell Center cafeteria. Please let us run out of room. Show up.
Very good. By the way, we have a magazine called Multinational Monitor that deals with globalization, and it's like 30 years old now. It's online. It's called multinationalmonitor.org. It's free. online, multinationalmonitor.org, if you want to keep informed. Now, I'm going to leave you with one story about my mother. And I'm not just because I love my mother, and I think this is a great story of insight, but it just shows you that every family has these little nuggets, these insights. Put them down. We have a website called 17traditions.com. Encourage families to send us a tradition or two just to get the ball rolling in their family. It's easy to procrastinate. Well, I'll granddaddy, we'll do them. It's too late. I was about 8 years old, and early on, my mother and father took griping about food off the table. They basically said, you're too young to know what to eat and what's good for you. You'll eat what we tell you to eat, and we'll eat what you eat. So, never had these kind of wrangles. I don't like this. So, but, it doesn't work all the time. So, one day she puts radishes, carrots, and celery, nice fresh appetizers, on the dinner table to begin dinner. And she said, here, these are very good for you, Ralph. And I said, I don't want to eat it. I don't like it. I don't want to eat it. I don't. And she's sort of looking at me like, how's she going to deal with this? So she leans over and she says to me, you keep saying I don't like, I don't want, who's I? Tell me, who's I, Ralph? I say, it's me, Ralph. What do you mean, who's I? She said, no. Let me ask you, is I your liver, your heart, your lungs, your brain, your kidney? You keep saying I. Who's I? By this time, I was totally flummoxed. I didn't know where she was going. And she smiled and said, I think I know who I is. I is your tongue. And why are you turning your tongue against your brain? Now, look what she could have said. She could have said, the world's greatest nutritionists say that if you eat these, you're going to be stronger and you'll outrun your classmates. That didn't work in her mind. What she wanted to do was make an internal struggle in my head, where I'm saying to myself, my brain is more important than my tongue. What am I doing having my tongue turned against my mind? After all, these are good for you, even though they're not sure. Now, that's the kind of story that stayed with me. So anytime I'm on the campaign trail, it's late at night, and there's not much food in the hotel, and they bring up some radishes or something, and my soldier said, I don't like radishes. I would say, who's I, Jason? Who's I? Now, they disciplined us with a stern look followed by a proverb. They never struck us. To them, that was failure and parenting. They had to strike and imagine hurting your own flesh and blood. So it was that kind of dialogue. Now, lots of families have that kind of dialogue. And obviously, it's not nonstop. There are a lot of things in families, frictions and trivias and so on. But to put it down is to preserve a family history. It means far more to descendants than any external advisories, or any external experience. When your own grandma, grandpa, great-grandma, aunt, uncle, mom, dad, and I think that is where the civic personality developed, because my parents did not divide a line between civic values, family values, and business values in my dad's restaurant. They were all one. They were all one. You didn't have one life in one category and one life in the other. And that way, and all 4 children were civically active. That way, you see, we developed an endurance. We developed a stamina and kind of functional transcendence of petty abrasions and different personality differences. So, on that note, I hope that you put down your own family traditions, because kids today are spending far too much time looking at screens. They're in virtual reality almost as much as they are in reality. And you know what they look at when they look at screens, and video games, and the television programs, and the YouTubes, and MySpace, all that. They're not getting human contact. They're not getting nature contact, even around their homes, the lawns, the rocks, the trees. They're there looking at screens, so it's more important than ever. It's out of that kind of family life that the challenges to entrenched power, corruption, and brutality, whether corporate or governmental, will emanate. That's where they come from. More than any other institution, families create citizen leaders. Thank you.